merengue.
Yo. Amigos, bienvenidos al Christian Podcast. Así es, Beto y Mili. El día de hoy, Mili, tenemos una súper entrevista. ¿Cómo estás? Ya compartiendo aquí desde los teléfonos esta entrevista que vamos a tener el día de hoy. We're so glad that you're here. We're going to have an amazing episode. This one's going to be in English here with my wife, Mili. So glad you guys are tuning in at christianpodcast.com. Maybe you're tuning in on Spotify or YouTube or X. Or where else are we, Mili? There's another one. Facebook. So maybe you're on any of those. Send us your emojis. Send us your questions. We're going to have an awesome guest. And we're going to discuss some really interesting theological topics. But I think today, Mili, I feel like people, when it's theological stuff, not everybody resonates with that. But everybody resonates with themes like violence, war. And I think that's what we're going to cover in today's episode. So for that, we're going to bring our guest to the show, okay? There we go. Jhon, Dominic Crossan, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Nice to be with you. And as you can see, since I'm Irish, I have green in the background.
Okay, yeah, we couldn't fix the green, but I think the green and the orange look great. So welcome to the show. So Dominic, I'm gonna kick it off with this, okay? This is just gonna like a preface or preface or prefacio. And just for the people that may be tuning in for the first time, you're the second time guest on the show, okay? So this is like Jhon Dominic Crossan 2.0 on christianpodcast.com. For that, we're so grateful. But also, I'm just going to admit some of your theology, it's out there, okay? It's for my perspective at least, it's far-fetched. But also, I think people, like I was telling Mili, a lot of people, you know, when you talk about theological topics, people are all over the spectrum. So for that, I'm so glad that we're going to cover maybe some topics that for the normal, you know, like Christian believer is going to be like, what are you guys talking about? I think, right? Or at least when they read some of your stuff. But you have a new book, right? And it's about Paul the Pharisee. And it's also about violence. So let's start with maybe just how you feeling today being the second time on the show and having a new book. How is that like for you?
It's a privilege to be back. And I think the last time you were all by yourself, but now you have vastly improved yourself. Millie as well.
We multiply.
I think so.
You take care of a Millie. Make him behave himself.
Awesome. Okay, well, welcome. That's great. Do you want to say anything else in regards to your book?
It's a fantastic book, but people will have to get it immediately because millions are being sold. Okay, You got it? Do you believe any of that?
I believe it.
It's a good book, period.
I love it. Okay, so Paul the Pharisee, we were talking with Jewish author maybe like 3 weeks ago or so. Amy Jill Levine, she's phenomenal. We love her. We know, you kind of like give each other some advice, maybe not advice, but you guys know what kind of like the work each other is doing. Yeah. And, when she was on the show, she was saying that Paul is one of the only Pharisees that we have historical accounts of, right? And now we have a book by you who is all about Paul as a Pharisee. So how can we interpret Paul in that sense? Why is it important that Paul is a Pharisee?
Well, first of all, of course, Paul says he was a Pharisee. So that's the first thing. And this is one of the cases where Luke actually agrees with him. So he says he's a Pharisee. Now, we have to do some therapy, though, because anyone who's read the New Testament knows that Pharisees come across as nitpicking legalists. You wouldn't want to meet one in a dark alley. That is part of the infighting in the family between messianic followers of Jesus and non-messianic followers. It's nasty. There's very, very nasty stuff in the New Testament, in Matthew, for example, about Pharisees, even though Jesus says, don't call people names. But then a few chapters later, he seems to be doing real good. This is the infighting of the first century. And you should kind of take it with a large grain of salt. Really. That includes your Christian, your most fervent Christian followers, when the Pharisees were not whitened sepulchres. They were not brood of vipers and hypocrites, which doesn't seem like a compliment. That's the infighting. They're fighting for the future of their own people. All right. That's the first thing. So could we bracket all of that? The same way, if you're listening to politicians debating, you listen with a large grain of salt, okay?
All the time. All the time.
All the time. Well, it's very good to take the same thing into religious discourse very often. Right? Now, if you leave aside the New Testament libel, I'm going to say, libel of Pharisees, and I think Amy Jill will agree with that comment, it's libelous, and shift over to Josephus, who is a more or less, on this case, neutral Jewish historian, who tells us about the Pharisees and what they are. And what fascinates him is their faith in the general resurrection. Now, that's what we really have to unpack. Where did that come from? Most of the biblical tradition, right up to maybe about 160 years before the time of Jesus, to date it that way for us, the time of the Maccabean revolt, the presumption was that God's sanctions operate in this world. Deuteronomy 28, for example, if you obey the Lord your God, everything goes well. Prosperity, fertility, victory. If you disobey the Lord your God, everything goes bad. Okay, that's the program. Now, what happened around 160, they had to explain to themselves, what does God do with the Maccabean martyrs? You can't say the martyr is being punished for his sins. He's dying to confess his God and his faith and his tradition. So quietly around the year 160, divine sanctions shifted from this world into the next. And I think that's a fact, not an interpretation. So in the past, you could imagine Daniel in the lion's den, saved right there. The lions all become pussycats. But now, after the Maccabean martyrs, people die, and their sanctions, their rewards, are their punishments. You can see the Maccabees, as they're being martyred in Second Maccabees, said, we will receive this back from God, but you people who are doing this will be punished. So now, we have a vision of justice after death, in the next life. But what do the Pharisees do that's particular about that? Because after all, Plato had said that a couple of 100 years before, that when the soul departs from this body, it goes into, now I'm using my language, just heaven, hell, or purgatory. Either goes into punishment if it's been bad, reward if it's been good, or a sort of an in-between state of surgical improvement if it needs to be fixed up. All right. Why didn't the Pharisees say, that's what happens? If you die and you're a good person, you're rewarded, and all the rest of it. They came up with this weird notion, and this is where it gets very, very profound, of a cosmic justice. It's not just that you or I or Millie, when we die, will appear before God, will be judged good, bad, or changeable, I guess, remediable, and go appropriately to heaven, hell, or purgatory. That's not what they're saying. They're saying there's going to be a great big cosmic judgment of the world. At the end of time, everyone who's ever existed, it's a lot of people, are going to rise. Everyone is going to rise out of the seas, out of the bellies of animals, out of the bellies of cannibals. And they'll all be judged publicly. Now, There are some people who take that literally. Honestly, I don't. I can't. And anytime people try to draw pictures of it, it just looks like sadomasochism on steroids or something like that. What I do see is that Pharisees have introduced a theme. Is there or is there not a cosmic justice? Not just for you or Millie or me or for individuals, but is the world basically a just place? And of course, what Paul says, and this is the special thing that Paul, the Pharisee, who becomes a messianic Christic, he's not a Christian yet because there aren't Christians. So I call him a messianic Christic. He believes that Jesus is the Messiah. That's what that means. And Christ is simply the Greek word for the Messiah. He says this great process of cosmic justice has begun with Jesus. This is 1 Corinthians 15. You can read it for ourselves. He says quite clearly, he calls it in Greek the anastasis nekron, the resurrection of the dead, and the anastasis Christou, the resurrection of Christ, are two sides of the one coin. They stand or fall together. Couldn't have the resurrection of Christ if there wasn't a general resurrection. Couldn't be a general resurrection if there wasn't a resurrection of Christ. Now, we have to read that over and over again. Why doesn't he say, well, Christ is special, he's the Messiah, so he gets a resurrection? There is in Judaism no concept of an individual resurrection. Just ain't there. It's a corporate thing, and it raises the issue, and this is the issue I would raise for anyone, not just if you're religious, theological, Christian, biblical, anything else. Is the world a just place? Is there a cosmic justice? Or to put it very bluntly, do we get away with things? If we, for example, decide to accelerate weapons of mass destruction, now you see where I'm going. If we invent weapons of mass destruction, do we really think we won't use them? Do we think we get away with it? And it's not just a question about, well, do you believe in God and God will punish you? I'm asking a question coming out of Phariseeism about cosmic justice. Can we do whatever we want to the world and somehow it'll all work out? Can we attack species, including our own? And somehow we'll get away with it. It'll all work out. Don't worry. That's what I see behind that simple word, Pharisee, when I'm talking about Paul, who remains a Pharisee, but becomes what I'm going to call a messianic Christic Pharisee. That is a Pharisee who believes that Jesus is the Messiah. That's what the book is about. And it's relevant for us today.
Wow. So that's Paul the Pharisee. So you mentioned the topic of violence, and I know this is, from what I've been following in your type of work, violence is a recurring topic for you. And I would like to know, why is it so important? I mean, I see it around us, right? Like even right now, people are talking maybe about a third world war and things like that. And it can get scary. And like you've said, we've talked about in a previous episode where you talked about escalatory violence and how it's almost like itchy and scratchy, right? Like the violence gets harder each time. So if we started with stones and sticks, the next one is not that. The next one is swords, and the next one is guns, and the next one is bombs, and the next one will be harder than that. But why is it important to you? Why is there a specific something that happened maybe in your life that makes you so engaged to this theme?
That might be a question for psychologists. There's nothing that I am aware of. Let me put that. I am Irish, obviously. I grew up in Ireland, but it was the first generation with the British gone, so that was lovely, and we could still blame them for everything. That was lovely too. So I was in the happy position of the first generation. I was born in 1934, when the imperialists were gone, but so recently gone that all our problems were due to them. None of that came from us. Now, after next generation, they're going to have to face, oh, yeah, we have our own and we're creating more. So I honestly don't know if somebody else, can see something that I don't. Is it? I've been told, well, you're against the Roman Empire because you're Irish and against the British Empire. My response to that is, how can you be against the British Empire? They gave up all of India and held on to a part of Ireland. That's kind of a Celtic sense of humor. You give up Hong Kong and keep Belfast. I mean, somebody's nutty there. So in any case, I don't see it. Mm-hmm. What I do see is I've spent my life in the biblical tradition, and it's all over the place in there. The big difference that I do see is that what the Bible sees as the danger for the world is war. It imagines, beating your swords into plowshares, your spears into pruning hooks, that. But what it never imagines is what you and I know, that maybe the day would come when the plows and the pruning hooks would threaten us as bad as the war. In other words, when we have weapons of mass destruction, and we have also humanly accelerated climate change, not just ordinary climate change that takes its own time, but accelerating human change. So we can't be maybe not fast enough to keep up with it, get ahead of it. The Bible really doesn't dream of that, and there's no point in saying it. Of course, it says God so loved the world, but it doesn't say, and then be very careful about climate change. No. We are now in a position where we see multiple threats from us to the world. I kind of summarize it in the book by saying that civilization is not the Titanic, it's the iceberg. We are the threat. So I see it in the Bible. And obviously then, of course, I see it all around me. But what I want to insist, the Bible sees it one way. I see it also a different way. I don't just see it as an ethical problem. We should be nice. I see it as an evolutionary problem. Can we survive as a species? Now, I'm not saying that as some kind of apocalyptic, terror. It seems to me just a simple question. And it's not my job to save the world. It's simply my job to tell the truth. And as I look at the trajectory of civilization, I see the following problem. Are we a magnificently doomed species? Talking about Homo sapiens. In the same way that the saber-toothed tiger was magnificent, but doomed and gone. Are we on the same trajectory? I don't ask it like to kind of terrify anyone. I'm just asking, I'm not being prophetic. I'm looking at a prophecy, but trajectory. I'm asking, have we ever invented weapons we didn't use? Have we ever invented ones that weren't worse than the preceding?
I'm like you. I'm a futurist, and I see trends. So that's why, having you on the previous episode and then having you here again and then following your work, I'm like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And I see that, following of events. So I completely agree with you. And I was actually, we were watching a movie about J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer of The Lord of the Rings. And he was a fighter in World War I. And it's interesting because in the middle of this movie, they use the phrase, he's going to fight the war to end all wars. So that kind of like brought me, okay, we got to talk about that because I don't think there's a human war to end all wars. But do you think there is a war or some sort of cosmic, maybe force, like even the Bible says, right? We're dealing against
Cosmic power.
spiritual, right, or cosmic powers or spiritual powers. Is that the war, and is that the one that's going to end all wars? Do you see a possibility maybe in that realm that will finish all wars? Is that the work of Christ, maybe even?
Nonviolent resistance. Now, I'm not talking about nonviolence. If you go to all my writings, you will never hear me talking about nonviolence unless just talking about somebody else. It's always nonviolent resistance. If somebody tells you Jesus was nonviolent, that is a half-truth. The Romans loved people who were nonviolent. That was their main business, promoting nonviolence. Nonviolent resistance is what got you crucified by the Romans. And Jesus was crucified, but his followers weren't rounded up, because if you were violent, the Romans crucified you and your followers. I mean, at least your main lieutenants, let's say. If you were crucified by yourself, that meant you had been, in their language, disturbing the peace. We would call it nonviolent resistance. So simply from the Roman data, from Josephus at least, and Tacitus, I know that Jesus was crucified, executed by the Romans. I know there weren't 12 crosses up there. There's nothing about his followers being rounded up and crucified. That tells me that Jesus was executed by the Romans for non-violent resistance against Roman law and order. And that makes absolute sense to me. That's what their civil law said you do with somebody who disturbs the peace, rouses up the people. We would call them demonstrations, actually. We would call them demonstrations. Anyone who does that, pick off the leader. Don't bother with the followers. Who cares about them? They'll go away once the leader is killed. So a war to end all wars is a cruel joke. Because even if in theory you could believe it for a moment, I can't. It's like, how would you solve being too obese by eating more? How would that exactly work? So a war to end all wars, it sounds to me like a cruel joke. Now, the only thing I can see that could end, and if you say, well, it can't be done, then fine. Then fine. That we have just said that we are a doomed species. Because we cannot stop something which is clearly escalating, and we can see it. You said it yourself a few minutes ago. We can see it across the last 10,000 years. We can see the escalation, except, of course, that it used to move much more slowly. Now, in the last century, in the 20th century, we started off with the Wright Flyer, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And we ended up with the stealth bomber. We are getting better and better and faster at the escalatory weapons of mass destruction. Whether we use them or not, it's another question. But we've got them, and we're getting them faster and better in terms of weapons. So a war to end all war, I think, is best seen as an ironic, sarcastic jibe at the First World War, which simply set up the Second. Almost necessarily set up the Second. So if you say, what can stop it? I'm not saying, well, if we all stop. No, that's not going to stop it. Why would we think that violence would go quietly into the good night? It have to be stopped by nonviolence. I don't know if that'll work. I really don't. And neither does anyone else. But I am certain that nothing else will. Unless we kind of make our planet uninhabitable or in some kind of a catastrophic apocalyptic scenario.
I always teach my kids, or I share with them, that we always fight with love. That for my family or for us is my recipe. We need to fight this with love, and you can see that with the human relationships. Like sometimes people they do things that is hard for us to love them, right? But when you fight with love and you're like, no matter what you do, I'm gonna still love you, because guess what? God loves you. Jesus loves you. So it's my command. And because I love myself, I'm going to love my neighbor no matter what. And sometimes it's tough, sometimes it's hard. But at the end, if you practice and if you have self-control and you're patient, at the end, God always wins, and love for me always wins.
All right. Let me say two things about that, Millie, really. I don't want to make the problem of violence or the solution to violence something that can only be done within religion or Christianity or the Bible or God or anything else that people who say, well, I don't believe in God, think then, well, there's no message here for me. It's all about God. I don't want to do that because it's a cosmic problem. And I think if I was talking to somebody who says, well, I don't believe in God and the Bible, I think all of that stuff is rubbish. I would say, okay, can I talk to you about human evolution?
And they're open, yes.
Can I talk to you about trajectory, the term I use? I know you don't believe in prophecy, let me say. Let me talk trajectory. Give me 10,000 years even. I don't need a billion, Let's look. Do you see it? Now, I also, now turning from that scenario to the biblical scenario. As far as I am concerned, obviously, I think the most startling thing Jesus ever said is love your enemy, really. Mm-hmm. So startling that almost nobody else quotes it directly in the first century. Paul comes very close to it in Romans, but he kind of says, love your enemy because God will really get him. That's not what Jesus says. You love your enemy because God does it. Because God sends the rain on the good and the bad and has the sunshine come up in the morning for the just and the unjust. But wait a minute. That's not Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says God's supposed to send a torrential rain on the baddies and a nice, gentle dew on the goodies. So where did Jesus get this idea that God is nonviolent? God ain't nonviolent at all. And in the book of Revelation, God's coming back again in charge of violence. So Jesus is saying something very radical. He's not just saying, love your enemy. He is saying that. He's saying, love your enemy because God does. And if you do that, you will be children of God. Heirs of God really is the word he's using. Now, that's a double-headed challenge. So my conclusion, your answer to your question, love your enemy, quotation marks, is Jesus's program of non-violent resistance. Because if you are evil and I just love you, and in effect, go right ahead and do what you're doing. I love you. Go ahead. No, that's not loving you. That's massaging your evil or something. But love your enemy is nonviolent resistance. If I love you, I will not use violence. So one way of stopping you is killing you. But if I love you, I will resist you nonviolently.
Yes.
Now, if there's nothing I need to resist you, then I won't need. But I want you to take seriously, why did Jesus say love your enemy? Why didn't he just say love everyone? I mean, that's so easy. Say love everyone, and we'd always say, yep, that sounds good. Love everyone. Certainly do that. Yep. He says love your enemy, and all of a sudden everyone wants to focus on the first word. I don't know if I could really love my enemy. know if he means like, and maybe if he means if you find him in the ditch like the Samaritan, at least you can take him out of the ditch because he's safe. No, he says enemy. So I'm swinging the whole thing to that way. Why didn't he say love everyone? Obviously, include your enemies. Because nonviolent resistance presumes you have something to resist.
Mm.
Of course you do. Of course you have something to resist. Look at the whole span of human nature. Violence is not going to go quietly away. It'll have to be resisted, and it will be dangerous. That's the great, what Paul calls the mystery of God. The mystery is, why on earth did God allow, I'll use a nice safe verb, allow Jesus to come under the Romans and get himself crucified? Why didn't he come sort of, when it was more peaceful? And Paul says, God wanted to reveal to us, not the Christians, but the human beings, the violence of their nature. God wanted to say, do you see what you do to the non-violent resistor, the Messiah Christ? You would crucify him, execute him, let's say, legally, officially. You wouldn't just lynch him with, a mob. You would take him up before Roman law and order, the boast of the Mediterranean. We have brought you law and order. We have brought you peace and civilization. Confronted with the nonviolent resistance, we will execute you. That, for Paul, is the mystery of God's plan, God's will, God's permission, God's allowance, God's decision. Choose your verb. He calls it the mystery. And I think that's what he saw when he made that visit to heaven in ecstatic trance that he tells about in 2 Corinthians. He said, I can't even tell you. But I think we could figure out what he's not telling us, because he says clearly that the rulers of this world, the archontes, the rulers of this world, archontes in Greek, would never have crucified the Lord of glory if they knew what was going on. What it would do is reveal the hypocrisy of their law and the savagery of their civilization. It's like a revelation. It's like suddenly, I see it. It took this case to show it to me. So nonviolent resistance is what Jesus was about, what Paul was about. And I will never agree with people who just want to use the word nonviolence. The Romans, I repeat, did not crucify people for nonviolence. They gave them prizes, as it were.
Wow. So you're saying resistance is essential, at least in the way you see maybe Jesus's work or ministry. And I mean, that's where I resonate a lot with what you have to say, because I love these ideas of like a cosmic war of some sorts. And I love the idea of, before we were Christian, we are humans, right? And the part that I kind of love about maybe even the word religion, and I might be using it just in my own context, but like when I look at the Bible, I don't necessarily look at it from a religious perspective, but I look at it from I'm learning who I am as a human, and it makes so much sense. And I told you that I had a little bit of a surprise for you towards, the end of the episode. And it's actually, it says the prophecy of Habakkuk. So I want to read it to you because, I'm just going to read it here on my computer. But when I was reading this, I totally thought of you. I think Jhon, Dominic, it's some sort of just words for my own context that are helpful for me, right? I think Jhon Dominic is a prophet. He's like Habakkuk, and the work he's been doing on nonviolence resistance for the most part, of his work, from the volumes I've read from you and then interviews I watch of you talking, like this is an important topic. And let me just read you Habakkuk 1-4, and we can maybe dissect how you relate to this or not. But you know, I don't know if you want to receive it as something God gave me for you, but if not, that's okay. I'm just gonna read it, and we'll just put it as I thought of you when I read this. Okay. The prophecy of Habakkuk. This is the message that the prophet Habakkuk received in a vision. How long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I am surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed, and there is no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted.
All right. Can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
You see what's going on there. Now, let me say what I suggest respectfully and with diffidence of what God would have said back to Habakkuk. He would have said, are you blaming me for this? Are you blaming me for this? I have told you, if you will, in Isaiah, that you must beat your swords into plowshare. Go read Micah 4, Isaiah 2. It doesn't say the day will come when God, I won't speak in the name of God, the day when God will beat your swords into plowshares and pruning hooks. It says you must do it. They will do it. There's nothing about God going to run an anvil chorus, beating swords into plowshares, the spears, and the pruning hooks. God's vision is that you must do it. So this is the great, big, transcendental con game, that we're waiting for God to do it for us. And the Bible says from one end to the other, God is waiting for us to do it with God. Yeah, the Bible does say, I don't think you guys can do it by yourself, because you're fighting yourself. You're trying to lift yourself by your bootstraps, and you can't do that. So, okay, you need transcendental leverage, as it were, to shift the world on its axis. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So I think we need a vision to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
We need a transcendental vision, but God's not going to do it for us. Of course, you can complain. I don't blame Habakkuk, but a complaint is a complaint.
And we're so easy to do that.
Yeah.
You know, and that's why we have Ephesians 6, right? Yeah. And it's talking about the armor of God. We just need to believe that we have that power through God.
Yeah. Now, one thing, Millie, I have tried very strongly in all my writing not to use war language, and that includes spiritual war language. I prefer the word struggle to war. So, for example, in the book Render Unto Caesar, the subtitle that my editor suggested is the war. I said, no, the struggle. I do not want to use war language, because if you can use war language for something totally spiritual, yeah, then maybe it's all right to use it for something totally physical. I think nonviolent resistance is the language to use, and to speak of struggle. So I'm not real happy with the parts of the New Testament when they talk about spiritual warfare. Yeah, you know, struggle is a good word. It's a very good word in English. Struggle, challenge. And I prefer very much to use that, because I think when we get used to using it, even on the spiritual realm, it's pretty easy to figure, well, that's normal. So in the spiritual, so in the physical. So I'm very much trying to get used to nonviolent resistance as the only program that I can see. Maybe there's something else I can't see that could stop the normalcy of violence, of escalatory violence. And as you said, that goes back to earlier works where escalatory violence, hyphenated, is really what I'm talking about. I mean, if you had the same threat today that you had in the first century from the Roman legions never endangered the world. They really didn't. You know, they couldn't even handle the Irish bogs or the German forests. So there was limits what they could do, and at nightfall they weren't good at fighting in the dark. So we are way, way more advanced in our destructive capacity. So it's the escalatory violence that we're facing.
Wow. Okay, so I mean, thank you for answering that Habakkuk's complaint. I loved your take on it, and also I think, when I look around now, maybe it's my complaint, maybe God put it in my heart, right? The violence is everywhere, and I cry, but you didn't come to save me. And in a sense, I almost...
You project yourself.
I project myself, but I also feel like, man, we're kind of doomed. If this evolution of violence has become so evident, we're right around the corner to something happening soon, right? If we consider, World War I was last century, World War II was last century, not that long ago. All these wars in between that happened, and we're in 2024. I'm like, man, are we due like something else? And now you start hearing of, riots happening in England or, Israel, and like all these things that is like, wow, is this it? Is this what Newton, or who was it? I think it was Isaac Newton, where, I don't know what World War III will be, but the next one will be, stones and sticks again.
Well, let me be very clear that World War III has already started. It's a
I believe that. Yes.
It's a sort of a vicarious war. So we don't fight with Russia, or we don't fight with China. Instead, we fight over here in the Middle East. We don't fight with Iran in the good old days where we'd have bombed one another. Now we fight surrogates. So we fight Iran through Israel, and we fight Russia, and of course there's the danger of Taiwan. Formosa, the old word Formosa almost came to my mind. Taiwan. There's a danger of a series of vicarious wars where the big powers, the great powers, are fighting each other somewhere else, which, pretty much almost what the Roman Empire did. Let's fight in Greece and, wreck their country. It's much easier to fight somewhere else than your own. But that could be the way it'll escalate. Mm-hmm. So again, I want us to say two things. Please, of course, understand the vision of nonviolence that is in the biblical tradition and is contradicted within the biblical tradition. There's lots of people who ain't happy with it. There's good old Jhon of Patmos who says, Jesus, get off your peace donkey and get on a war horse. I don't condemn that. I understand it. If somebody suggests nonviolent resistance, violence will respond, of course, by somehow twisting it. Of course. I mean, do we really think that just the idea of nonviolent resistance and violence will dissipate like the morning mist? Of course not. It'll fight back. I'm using deliberately pugilistic language. Of course it will fight back. But the challenge is this, and it's a challenge to our species, and it has nothing to do with whether you're Christian or non-Christian, biblical, non-biblical, theistic or non-theistic. It's a human as you said, it comes in on the human level. Then it can be put in various other languages. It comes in on the human level. Are we a self-doomed species? That's the only question we're asking. And it doesn't help to say, oh, yes, we are. Or, oh, no, we're not. It is to try and look at the record so far and to look at the counter record, because there is a counter record of nonviolent resistance. Mm-hmm. It's been there. As far as I know, as a historian, it was invented in the Jewish situation. I don't know if it organized anywhere else in history before it happens in the first century, between the violent revolt of 4 BCE and the violent revolt of 66. In the 70 years in those years, there are experiments with organized, massive, non-violent resistance, backed by martyrdom, of course, in the Jewish tradition. I don't know of it anywhere else. I mean, organized. I'm not talking individuals. So I think the background of John the Baptist and Jesus and the first century, by people who saw the threat that our violence will escalate against the Romans, and the Romans could destroy us. Could even destroy us by forbidding Judaism as a religion, which they must have been very close to doing, by the way, after the Second War. So I think it was invented as an option, as a way, not by Jesus, but within his Jewish matrix, as a way of opposing Roman violence. And it's in Josephus. Josephus tells us this. I didn't discover it myself. I just read Josephus carefully. So,
which part of Josephus were you reading where you discovered this?
Well, it's in all the references I've given in my book, Render unto Caesar. But, for example, Josephus writes the Jewish War, as we know, in the 70s, Jewish Antiquities in the 90s. In the Jewish War, he admits that there were some people, he kind of dismisses them, who used nonviolent resistance. But then in the Jewish Antiquities, he says, well, we had 3 main philosophies. He doesn't say, political factions. We had the Essenes, we had the Sadducees, and we had the, who am I missing? The Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. And then he finally admits, and it's like you have to drag it out of him. Yeah, there kind of was a 4th philosophy, that's his term. And you say, well, wait, what's the 4th philosophy? What's it doing? Nonviolent resistance. And he tells us about it. He describes it in great detail. Nobody has to invent it. It's right there. You only have to read it. And I think he's more surprised by it than he is by war. Yeah, people rebel against the Roman Empire. Shouldn't do it, but what's new? But nonviolent resistance, that's not us. Well, yeah, it kind of is us. Well, it's a 4th philosophy. It's not one of the regular philosophies. Well, yeah, but it is. So he's torn because he knows it's there, and he's terrified, correctly, rightly, that Rome might decide, okay, it's your religion that's causing these rebellions. There's going to be 4 of them, by the way. So we're finally going to solve the Jewish problem. We're going to forbid your religion. That's what terrifies Josephus, rightly, by the way, that Rome might decide, okay, we've had 4 BC, 66, 150, 132. Then we do to you what we did to the Celts. We forbid the Celtic religion. That's the only way to stop you. That terrifies him. Wow. So he does admit, though, it's there. Mm. And if you compare the way he kind of squelches it in the Jewish War in the 70s, he doesn't want to say it, and then how he finally admits it 20 years later that it was there, you can see him struggling with his own historical and theological conscience. Should I tell this? But it's there.
Mm. No. How we can start this movement, non-violence resistance? What we can do in a practical ways on our life daily?
Well, there are people who are doing it in all sorts of ways and have nothing whatsoever to do with religion or anything else. But I think religion is there, Christianity is there. And what horrifies me, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to use the word. What horrifies me is that there are Christian pastors today who are sponsoring violence. And God, of course, who are sponsoring violence. Now, in the book of Revelation, the Antichrist is what happens when politics and religion become equated. The Antichrist there is exemplified by Nero, where politics and religion are exactly the same thing. It appalls me today that we have hints, visions, aspects of Antichrist in our own country, but also in Russia, by the way. Sarah and I were there a couple of years ago, and you could see very clearly how religion, Putin's government, and Russian religion, Orthodox religion, are hand in glove.
Wow.
And it appalls me, as I said, in this country to hear pastors, Christian pastors, who think that religion and politics, I don't mean influencing one another, I mean unified. Unified.
It's crazy because I remember Beto once, he wrote me a passage from the Bible where he was saying, maybe you can remind me, Beto, it's like, don't be like them, like the leaders of the kings. And remember?
Yeah, I forgot where it was, but I think it's Jhon, where Jesus is saying, I think it's Jhon when he gives the revelation of who he is. I can't remember exactly, but yes, like Jesus is saying, don't be like the governments of this world. Like you are supposed to be different.
So it's like two different kingdoms.
Yeah.
Well,
right?
You can understand it because the prophet is always against the king. There is no example in the New Testament of a prophetic king. You know, David is the king, sure enough, but it takes Nathan to tell him what he's doing is wrong. And David at least has the grace in the story to say, okay, you're right. I shouldn't have done that. So there is a creative tension. There's nothing wrong with it between religion and politics, and both work most healthily when there is a tension. It's not that religion is always perfect, politics is always wrong. No, that's rubbish. It's a kind of a creative tension. So it horrifies me. I'll take the word again. It appalls me to find especially Christian pastors in this country now who are celebrating Antichrist, because Antichrist is any program that equates religion and politics, equates them. I mean, so they're exactly the same. I don't mean at all, criticism, but it would be the equivalent of the Bible if, for example, if David had killed Nathan and said, okay, now I'm the prophet king.
Okay.
No, the prophet is the one who the king is going to be killing. That's the biblical tradition.
Wow. We're going to have actually on another episode, author named Caleb Campbell, and his title of the book is How to Love Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor. So tune into that because it's going to be interesting. And I think that's okay. So I just want to give my opinion before we wrap up the episode, because I'm not trying to contradict you, or what you said, but one of my takeaways today is that from your vantage point, like you are trying to avoid using war language, even in your regular speaking, and you almost my sense is that you almost wish it wasn't in the Bible, like the Bible wouldn't have all this war language, right? So I think part of that is moving, for me, even as a Christian evangelical, however you want to take that, because from my vantage point, I don't know if this is a gift God gave me or what, but I have never considered the Bible like an inciter for violence. Even if the Bible speaks about, a war event or violence like that, I have never taken it in the sense of like, oh, that means I gotta, raise my fist and start fighting against the empire. Like, I've never taken it like that. I've always taken it more like God's got to be some sort of like peacemaker, cosmic peacemaker even, and trying to come into the human fight and say, hey, can my kids get along? And I think he's been trying to do it all along, right? So, but I love that you mentioned that, that the war language, because I think language is important, right? And when somebody says fight, like I've used the word fight, it can mean a lot of things, right? And maybe depending on your political climate, it can mean it can incite even violence, right? So I think that's huge for me, at least I would say. But all that to say, my opinion is whenever I read in the Bible that there's violence, like I never take it literally like, oh, that means we gotta, grab our swords. Even when Jesus says, right, okay, let's grab a sword and let's go. Okay, we have 2 swords. It's like, that's enough. Like I've always taken that verse, even like, that's not what my business is about. We don't need those. But a lot of people use passages like that to say, oh, that means we got to carry our guns, in the Second Amendment and that sort of stuff. I'm Mexican, by the way. I grew up in Mexico, and I always consider even our country in Mexico to be a pacifist country. We were never involved in wars in that sense. I mean, maybe they sent like 1 legion or something like that. But I think from Mexico's vantage point, we have always been a peacemaking country, So I don't know if maybe that's part of my background where I grew up in, that I've always had this sense of I want to be a peacemaker rather than, war making.
I think that's who you are, Beto. Like even, in our family, when it's a conflict, Beto is always in the middle and he never take part. He is in the middle, and yeah, you help us to calm down and in a peaceful way all the time.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, that's who you are.
We are blessed because blessed are the peacemakers.
Amen.
Amen to that. Okay. So, Jhon, last time you were here, we used the emojis. Do you want to go over our emojis again?
Oh, sure.
And maybe think about whatever is resonating with you nowadays. So I'll bring our emojis because, we love those. So, boom. There are the emojis, right? So from blasphemous to divine, and to wrap up the episode, we go over these. Okay, so the first one will be the blasphemous emoji. So, John Dominic, what is the most blasphemous idea you can think of as of 2024?
What I've said about the Antichrist has been so popular in America at the moment. We're fostering the Antichrist in our church.
Scary.
That is.
Wherever you find politics and religion, and by that you can make it much. I was talking generally. I'm talking very much more specific. If you're talking about right wing politics and right wing religion, bedfellows together, unified. That is really not just my judgment, it's the judgment of Jhon of Patmos. Wherever you find those 2 things, as you did in the Roman Empire being God, and if ever you find politics and religion equated, or what term do I want to use, like totally mixed up together, so you don't know where one ends and the other begins, Like you looked at a Roman coin and it said Caesar was the son of God on the coin. Was that political or religious? Wherever they call that the Antichrist. That's what Revelation calls the Antichrist. The confusion of collaboration of religion and politics. Then exemplified usually by a certain person. Nero. So I call that blasphemy.
Wow. Okay. Next one is skeptical emoji. So what are you still skeptical of?
I suppose I understand at least people who are skeptical about nonviolent resistance and would say, that's just silly. You'll just get killed. So you have to defend yourself. But I'm not talking about whether you defend yourself. I'm talking about the evolutionary threat. Of course, a small country, if it's attacked, will defend itself. Of course it will. Of course it will. And if you or I are attacked, we will defend ourselves. And there are times we should probably use violence to defend somebody else. I'm not asking that ethical question. I'm asking a cosmic question about evolution. Can our species survive this violence, which is absolutely necessary? We say that violence was absolutely necessary. Let me use a safe one, the Second World War. That's relatively safe. Maybe that was good and bad. But the whole process, it's like a 16-year-old that smokes the first cigarette that says, am I going to die of cancer now? No. Well, how about a second one? How about we know what happens? It's an escalatory process, and at a certain point, yes, is the answer. So I think of violence as humanity's drug of choice. And the process of getting rid of it is getting rid of an addiction. So I could see somebody being skeptical, and I could, even myself, I might sometimes get skeptical and say, this is simply silly. We just kind of, blowing into the wind. So skeptical there.
All right. Well, comes up inspired emoji. So you got to give us something hopeful.
All right. No, but all right. I see a double hope. One hope is the whole biblical tradition and its power. All right. That's hopeful. It's there. It's been still there after 2,000 years. But there's also another hope. We are not in charge. I'm not talking about God. I'm talking about human evolution. Maybe we can destroy ourselves, but maybe we can't. Don't think we can necessarily. Because we're not in charge. Human evolution is part of cosmic evolution. Wherever you are in God, theist or atheist or whatever, you don't get out from under evolution. And if you want to test that, try gravity. Gravity works exactly the same for everyone.
All right. Well, next comes holy emoji. What's a holy idea in this debate?
Non-violent resistance is the program for which the slogan is love your enemy. Love your enemy, non-violent resistance. You want to
Love it.
You want to love your enemy, resist your enemy. Don't love your enemy by saying, look, I see your people. Yeah, they are annoying. I see why you want to kill them. Maybe I wouldn't do it myself, but I do see why you do. Yeah. Love your enemy by nonviolent resistance. That's the holiest idea, because I think it's the heart of Jesus. So if you keep saying that, love your enemy by nonviolent resistance, keep saying it until you hear a sound in the background, and you might be hearing the heart of Jesus, which might be the heart of God. Just keep saying it to see what happens. Okay? Our fifth emoji.
Divine emoji. Okay, so you gotta step it up a notch to the cosmic level.
Okay, well, if you're a Christian, you can't step it up beyond Jesus, who is the revelation of God. So I'm saying basically what Jesus has said is that the reason you love your enemy by nonviolent resistance is not because, you won't get yourself killed. Let's be very prudent. The Romans have legions, so let's not fight them. We get killed. Jesus said the reason we do it is because that's the way God operates the world. It sounds awful to me, like that's what evolution demands of us. So I'm going to say the holiest idea is nonviolent resistance in imitation and participation in God. But Jesus says that'll make you, he says, sons. Sons are simply heirs in the patriarchal society. So heirs of God. You want to be heirs of God. Practice nonviolent resistance because God does. Not because it's good politics or whatever. So that would be my fifth one.
Love it. Okay. Overall, Millie, how do you feel with our emojis today? Which one do you want to just like our final emoji? It's your call, Millie, your shot.
I'm super inspired. I'm trying to bring all this concept and put it on my brain.
Millie's face is the
and say like,
fire emoji.
Oh my gosh, yes, I lived this before, and I love these words like non-violence resistance. I practice that in my own home with my family. I think that's where we are invited to do it first, right? When your people around you, with your neighbors, it's where we need to start it, and I'm saying that because my background, I'm Mexicans as well, and
the chancla is not very.
They use this.
The chancla is a lot of violence in the chancla.
A lot. So that's how I grew up, and I did it with my kids at the beginning, and I need to learn a new ways. And when the way I did it was without violence in my home. I start doing with more self-control and coming to my kids. I teach them, the violence was not working for me. So I stopped hitting them. I honestly did like so bad at the beginning. And I asked for forgiveness. It was so hard, for me too. And I took some classes. I read books, to don't do it no more. It was so hard for me. But works. At the end, I had that self-control. Thanks to all these books and all these other programs, and I have a better communication with my kids. They were angry too. They were fighting back. And was a chaos in my house. Was a word in my house. That I love it. I think that message is for all of us, and we can live it in our homes. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Yes.
All right. Okay, so Jhon, where do you want to point people again to get your latest and greatest book? You said it's out everywhere and everybody's going to buy it.
Buy it by the millions. It's been made into a movie. No, don't.
It's going to come out in a movie.
Please. Yeah. Netflix is out there making it into a series. No, I'm kidding. No, it's available, of course, on Amazon. And basically, to see the arguments behind it, don't just say, well, this is what he says, and he's got an Irish accent, so it must be true. No, this has to do with the future of our species. I don't want to say it's bigger than religion, but in one sense it is, because the great religions speak to the human tradition. They don't just speak to their own people. They speak to their own people for the whole human species. So I would say, get the book, get it from Amazon, as it's the easiest way to get it.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you everybody for tuning in today. If you're watching, listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, we invite you to like and subscribe to this episode. All right, we have more episodes coming up. You can always visit us at christianpodcast.com, and we'll see you guys on the next one.